Now, I got to tell you, I got to admit to you before I read the scripture, of all the stories in the scriptures, this might be my personal favorite. But that might have more to do with being weird than anything else. But you could make a really good movie out of this. However, I'm just reading the full 20 verses and part of the 21st verse of the 19th chapter of the first book of Kings. You got to know what happened right before this to fully appreciate today's story. Now, remember this guy, Elijah the Tishbite. That's his name, the prophet Elijah. He gets this call from God, and it turns out he kind of is a pretty good prophet. When he puts his mind to it, boy, he really goes at it. We're going to find out today what happens, though, when the going gets tough for Elijah. Now, Elijah was sent to the people of Samaria. That's where Ahab was the king. Now, Samaria became southern Israel, Judah, and everything like that. So this is he was sent to the Israelites, who were supposed to be faithful to Yahweh. However, they had been led along the path of worshiping Baal. That's B-A''A'-L. You've heard that. So Elijah is sent to them. Elijah gets there, finds out that Jezebel, who's the queen, is the one who's really pushing everybody to worship Baal, okay? And Jezebel, as a good, smart queen would do, has hired a whole bunch, hundreds of prophets to tell all the people what she wanted them to hear. And they also tell Jezebel what she wants to hear and tell her that that means that she's good with God. See, about the Baal stuff. So there's all these prophets. So what do you think Elijah does? Does anybody remember? That's not the story for this morning. You remember what Elijah does? He sets up a contest. Okay? They put all this firewood together on what could be like a funeral pyre. You know, all this firewood, and they douse it with water. And Elijah says, okay, you prophets of Baal, see if you can get this thing to burn. And so, one by one, they go up there. They can't get it to catch fire. And then they all go up together. They can't get it to catch fire. So you know the next part of the story, don't you? Elijah goes up, and what happens to the big, wet bunch of wood? It burns. It burns. So he won the contest. But that wasn't the end. Elijah then picks up a sword, we're told, and he killed all the hundreds of the prophets of Baal that Jezebel had on her payroll. Okay? A little bit overdone, okay? That's the part that goes on before this morning's story. Now again, I'm reading from the 19th chapter of 1 Kings, starting at the first verse. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how Elijah had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Putting on a hit. You got that? Then Elijah was afraid. Elijah got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But Elijah himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. Elijah asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O God. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then Elijah lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched Elijah and said to him, "Get up and eat." Sort of like parents in the morning before school. No, really, that's what's happening here. Elijah looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. Elijah ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched Elijah and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." Elijah got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Again, Elijah just goes overboard every time he does something in this story. 40 days and 40 nights, and he ends up at Horeb, the Mount of God. At that place, Elijah came to a cave, and he spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altar, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." That is one of the best sob stories ever in all of literature. It is. It was pretty good, don't you think? Well, anyway, God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for God is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before God, but God was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a great fire, but God was not in the fire. And after all that, after the fire, the sound of utter silence. When Elijah heard that, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left. They are seeking my life to take it away." The same sob story. Then God said to Elijah, "Go, return." Here ends the reading of Scripture. May God grant its meaning to our hearts and our minds. Did you notice that God had to, the angel had to wake Elijah up twice? It really is like kids in the morning before school, or me on a Saturday. But seriously, there was so much in that story, wasn't there? How many of you remember the group Earthquake, Wind, and Fire? Remember? Did you know that that's where they got their name? But it was actually, yeah, that's where they got their name. However, earthquake, wind, and fire, it flows better than saying wind, earthquake, and fire. So that they got the order wrong, but it didn't matter. Now, this is a story of a prophet of the Lord, a faithful human being who had believed he was sent to the Israelites to keep them from worshiping Baal. And he realized that the way the world was put together, in order to get people to be faithful, sometimes you had to get them to see that what they were doing was wrong before you asked them to do what was right. Okay? So he was trying to figure out how to get the people to stop worshiping Baal. Well, it was, after all, the queen who was telling them to worship Baal. So he figured, if I'm going to do what God sent me to do and get the Israelites to be faithful to God again, I got to get rid of Baal. So he gets rid of the prophets. Well, he at least showed them up, didn't he? That must have been quite a thing to have all that wood. Now, you know what a funeral pyre is? P-Y-R-E? That's how you used to cremate bodies. And a good funeral pyre will be really big, full of all kinds of wood, and it'll burn a whole bunch of bodies if you want it to. It really burns. But if you pour water on it, it's probably not going to do too well. That's what the story says happened, and they all failed except Elijah. He had the faith that his way was right, and it set it on fire. Now, he could have stopped there. He could have stopped there. He could have said to the people, whose God do you think is more powerful, Baal or Yahweh? But he didn't. Why didn't he? Why didn't he? It says he took up a sword. One guy with one sword and killed hundreds of Jezebel's prophets. Now, that sounds like a video game to me. But even in video games, it's not a sword. It's one of those crazy machine guns or something. Now, seriously, why did he do that? Think. Why would he do that? Well, he was getting carried away with himself. He was. Hey, I won the fire contest. Boy, watch this. He kills the prophets. And suddenly nobody's talking about Yahweh anymore. They're talking about Elijah and what he did. So Jezebel, who's not the nicest person in the world, she wasn't to begin with, puts out a contract on his life. I mean, if you were Jezebel, wouldn't you do that? Well, you wouldn't be Jezebel, I guess. But no, seriously, so she puts out a contract on Elijah's life. He hears about it, and what's he do? He runs. Can you see this movie? Yeah, what a great movie this could be. He runs, and it takes him 42 days to get where he's going. Remember, first he goes to Judah and leaves his servant there. The next day, he goes to a broom tree and lies down. Okay. Now, 40 days he's in the wilderness till he gets to Mount Horeb. You remember anything else about Mount Horeb that might have been important in the stories of ancient Israel? That was the mountain that Moses went up. Yeah, that's the mountain. Every time you go up there, something happens with God. And Moses comes back down with the 10 Commandments, remember? But what happened while Moses was up there? Storms. There was an earthquake, there were storms, there was lightning and thunder and all this stuff when Moses was up there. Now, the people weren't up there, but Moses was. So there's earthquake, wind, and fire and all these stories because God is very close by. Okay? That's this story again. But this has got a really different twist to it. First of all, now, you got to get this pictured right. Elijah's in the cave, remember? And the first thing we hear in the story is that this voice comes and says, "What are you doing here?" And he has the best sob story in the world. I've been faithful, and now they're asking me to pay for it, and I'm running away. Please save me. Tell me I don't have to do anything more. And instead, the voice says, go out because God is going to pass by. Okay? Elijah doesn't go out. Did you notice that? He doesn't go out. Instead, God passes by and the earthquake and the fire and the wind and everything. And it's not just a breeze, okay? It's splitting mountains. I imagine it was at least a 7 or 8 on the Richter scale earthquake. And we don't even get told much about the fire, just fire is fire, you know. And after all that's over, then Elijah goes out. That's important. Elijah was only willing to meet God on Elijah's terms. That's another part of this story you have to be careful about. Okay, God, I'll do your stuff, but here's my conditions. I don't want to have to live through a wind and an earthquake and a fire. When you get done with your stuff, call me again. And all there was left afterward, remember? The sound of utter silence. Have you ever heard that? The sound of utter silence? It's almost impossible in our world today to understand what that's like. The sound of utter silence. But it was in that sound that Elijah heard, get out, come out here and stand before God. So Elijah finally goes out, and he gives his sob story again, tells this voice, here's why I'm here. Now, if this was a soap opera, what would the response be? The response would be, wow, you've really had a tough time, Elijah. You know? That's not fair. You've done such good work, and now all they are is jealous. They want to kill you. So I'll take care of you. I'll do this. I'll give you some sheep to herd and take you a couple 100 miles away or something like that. Wouldn't that be the way a soap opera would end? A benevolent, beneficent God. I mean, come on, that's who the voice was. It was God speaking to Elijah. What did he tell Elijah to do? Go and return. Thanks, God. Yeah, right. In fact, you know what he told him to do? He was told to go and be a prophet again. He was going to anoint a new king over Israel. He was going to anoint a new prophet to take over his job, right in the middle of the people that were trying to kill him. Thanks a lot, God. Where did we get the idea of a benevolent God? I don't know. It's not from this story. I identify with this story. Many, many, many times I have made the very, very important decision in my life to never set foot in a church again. And I mean that. But I keep doing it. And that's why I like this story so much. It's kind of like my story. I keep getting sent back, and I can't say, well, I can say no, but anyway. I end up doing this because I find that once I've said yes, it's not about me anymore, ever again. Because trying to say I've had it, which I said more than once, is in effect telling God, let somebody else do it. Because we do believe that God's creation is ongoing, that God is still actively making this universe happen. We believe that. So if there is something we believe we've been called to do, and we say yes, that's important. That's part of what the plan is for God's universe going on. And really, God's not interested in our sob stories or finding someone else to do it. Make some sense? That's what this story's about. Not that God is benevolent or not, just like it is that once you are called by God and you say yes, there's not somebody else to do what you've said yes to. First Congregational Church in Lowell, tutoring, feeding the community. We've said yes to that, haven't we? And we believe that somehow it's because Christ has called us to do that, don't we? I hope so. What are we doing all this stuff for if we don't believe that? Well, there's not going to come a time where when we get tired of it, and we will, maybe we already have, a few of us, we can't just say, God, get somebody else to do it. There isn't anybody else. Let me give you a couple examples of some things that I, as your pastor, have to worry about because that's what you're paying me all these bucks for, okay? Now, but seriously, we very wisely have a separate ministry incorporated under the laws of the state of Michigan, which is our feeding food ministry. The reason we did that was twofold. We were being wise as serpents and innocent as doves, as that old rabbinic saying that Jesus used one time. Because A, we never quite can be sure what every 5 years the bank is going to do about our mortgage. Every 5 years they call it, and then either they say, okay, we'll renegotiate it, or we'll just do it again for another 5 years the way we've been doing it. Or they could just say, no, we aren't interested. Go get yourself financing someplace else. That's another thing about go let somebody else do it, and it ain't going to happen. So we believed that this ministry was so important that even if we didn't have the building, we could keep it going. That was one of the reasons we incorporated. There's another just, smart, wise as a serpent, innocent as a dove reason. A whole lot of foundations and the federal government, for instance, or the state of Michigan and things like that, are a whole lot happier giving money to something that has its own organization. It's only going to be there to feed people instead of one of those things that nobody knows quite what it is. It's called a church. So those were the reasons we did it. But there is no question that if it weren't for the people of the First Congregational Church of Lowell, there would be no Lowell's Open Table. There would be no meal every Thursday night. And that's the way it has to be 5 and 10 and 20 years from now if there's still going to be Lowell's Open Table. It has to be the people of this congregation who make it happen. The better we get known, it seems, more and more people want to give money to this feeding ministry. That's fantastic. That's what we had hoped would happen, isn't it? But if the rest of us get really kind of, oh, well, they don't need me to go and help with that because, it's got enough money. We could hire some cooks and we could do this or that. Or let's let somebody else run this thing. We'll just let them use the building. That isn't the way, apparently, it works in God's realm. That's a form of saying, God, it's gotten hard enough, and we've gotten enough people interested. We aren't going to do it anymore. Get somebody else to do it. Let somebody else do it. But it was God through Christ who called us. And it wasn't with bells and whistles and drums and trumpets or anything like that. I don't think in the whole time of New Beginnings, when we were trying to perceive what's our future, I didn't hear anything like that. Did you? Was there an earthquake that I missed? There were some windstorms that winter, but they weren't splitting mountains and knocking rocks apart. And certainly there wasn't a fire, or we wouldn't have rebuilt the building the way it is. So there was none of that stuff. But God spoke, God spoke through Christ. We heard Christ come and say, come, follow me, give yourselves. It was just a quiet, almost silent voice. That is the way it works most of the time. It's the way it'll work in your life too, in your own individual life. It's very seldom that you're going to hear a big voice, unless it's Bill Cosby's record from long ago, saying, Moses, or saying, you. You'll hear it, but you won't know until afterward what it was said. It's in the sound of utter silence that God speaks in the ongoing creation. Don't be afraid of that silence. But when it comes, listen well. And if you say yes, you know the way your life is going to go from then and forever. And so do we as a church. Those with ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.